Well, our next speaker will be Vance. Is it
Ginn?
Ginn. All right, sorry.
It's okay.
And he's going to be telling us, he's also with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. He's going to be telling us more about why the Texas model works and some of the flaws in the Texas model.
Yes.
Thank you.
Should we change the presentation?
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Doing all right? Good, good, good. So I'm working also at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. I'm in the Center for Fiscal Policy. So we work quite closely with James Quintero, my colleague. I also work with Talmadge Heflin. I don't know if many of y'all know him, but he's the director of the Center for Fiscal Policy. And we try to do some great work to try to bring to light what's going on in Texas and what's happening overall and what can be passed on with this overall Texas model and what we need to do differently. Really what I'd like to title this presentation are the successes and failures of the Texas model. I'll have to go over that some today. I think James already described we're a 501c3 non-profit, nonpartisan, free-market think tank here in Texas, one of the largest in the nation, state-level think tank. And so our fiscal policy core principles of the Texas model is that you have low taxes, with a key being no personal income tax in the state of Texas, and sensible regulation. Now, that's more at the state level, maybe not necessarily at the local level, as James was mentioning. There's a lot of nonsensible regulation that's going on there. And really, let liberty and free markets work. I think we can all kind of agree with that. And there's some studies that really show that that's the case. And we have some good comparisons that we can go through and look at to see which one of these policies really do work. And they're achieved by reducing the footprint of government. Over the summer, I read a great book by Osamoglu and Robinson called Why Nations Fail. I don't know if many of you have read that book, but it really brings up some good points about how political and economic institutions matter. And there's a lot of good information in there looking at the historical nature of economic and political institutions over time and how those institutions that are more inclusive institutions, such as democracies and capitalism, those tend to flourish and bring about more prosperity over time. Whereas you have those that are extractive institutions, your autocracies, socialism, they tend to fail and have less prosperity over time. And so we really want to be able to focus on are those type of inclusive institutions that are going to bring about more prosperity. And one way to look at that is economic freedom of the world, right? And economic freedom of North America. That's published out of the Fraser Institute. Maybe many of you are aware of their work. But basically they look at different components, sound money, size of government, taxes, things of that nature. And we look at what's important is looking at economic rights and private property rights are the keys to providing more economic freedom and more prosperity over time. Where one study shows that as you have more decline, the more that economic freedom declines, the less economic opportunity and less economic growth that you'll have over time. And it's a pretty sizable change. For every 1 point drop in the economic freedom index, you have about a 1 to 1.5% long-term drop in your growth rates, which is substantial in reducing that over time. Oh, that didn't turn out right. But overall, what this would show is that economic freedom in the U.S. is continuing to drop, which is one reason why many feel the American dream is non-existent anymore. We're failing to provide the American dream across the nation, where we went from third back in 2000. If you look at the economic freedom of the world, based on 157 countries, we were third, and now we've declined to 16th. So this was actually flipped. I think it's from using the PC to the Mac here, but it should be flipped where it's going down, right? And so what we're seeing, though, is why is this the case? Well, our size of government is ranked 74th. Legal system and property rights, 29th. Sound money, 38th, with the debasing of the currency by the Federal Reserve. I mean, all these cases that's going on. So I want to give you an idea of what's happening at the national level and what are some of the things going at the state level. So one thing we have is fiscal policy, right? I mean, two key components that they've been trying to use to get us out of this great recession that maybe we're in a recovery now. One was fiscal policy. If you look at since 2000, federal government spending was up a remarkable 115%. Astonishing probably is a better word. And just since Q4 2008, it's up 27%, which was the period of time where we had TARP and the bailout of the banks, the American Recovery Investment Act. All of those things contribute to a huge increase in federal government spending and to try to fill the gap, to try to stimulate the overall economy. And instead what we've seen is a huge increase in the national debt. Total debt is up 214% since 2000, just over a short period of time, and up 70% since the Q4 of 2008. So substantial increases in national debt, which is increasing the size of government and the burden on all Americans across the way. Well, the other thing that they tried to use was monetary policy, right? So what can the Federal Reserve do to stimulate the economy? Well, they dropped interest rates down, right? The federal funds rate was pushed down to 0% in December of 2008, and it's been left there where we had rounds of quantitative easing and so forth, right? Y'all know about some of these things that's been going on. And so with this, if you look at the Taylor rule that some like to look at over time, that was tracked pretty closely with the federal funds rate and what this Taylor rule would say the federal funds rate would need to be based on different economic factors, economic output, and inflation rates. During the 2000s, tend to leave the rate, so the federal funds rate is this solid line here. The ideal rate based on this Taylor rule is the dotted line. We left the rate too low for too long, which contributed to the boom in the housing market and the eventual bust, which led to the Great Recession. Well, now, with this rate being left so long at 0%, the Taylor rule shows that you might have it up to 2% since 2010. So we've had almost 5 years, a much longer period compared to what you had during the mid-2000s of a lower interest rate. So just consider all of the bubbles that are bubbling up in the economy and the misallocation of resources that have tended to take place across the economy. Well, some say, you know what, we don't have any inflation, right? There's no inflation, so the Fed's doing a good job. We have this recovery going on. You know, they reported yesterday that the unemployment rate is now 5% across the nation. Did y'all see that? But if you include the underemployed, right, and the discouraged workers who have just dropped out, it's closer to 10%. And the labor force participation rate remains at a 37-year low. People have just dropped out. I'll mention that here a little more in a minute. But yeah, so CPI here, so this also didn't show up correctly, but CPI, since December 2008, when you had the Fed lower interest rates to 0 to 0.25%, up to August 2014, the last round of quantitative easing ended, you had CPI was up 12% during that period. So average over 6 years, it's about 2%. Not much inflation according to CPI. However, you have a 75% increase in the price of gold. You have a 124% increase in oil prices. Excess reserves up 252%. So there is inflation out there. It's just being hidden in a lot of ways that they like to measure it. And so what has this really shown us? Trying to build onto this American dream of what these policies should try to do at the national level as they've decreased economic freedom nationwide. Well, instead of bringing about more economic growth, we've had a 2.2% average growth during this recovery, right? It's an abysmal recovery period compared to our normal economic recovery cycles that we normally see, along with just average growth. Average growth is usually 3 to 3.5% measured by GDP. When you have recoveries like we had during the Reagan administration, it was closer to 5%. Now we're only growing at 2.2%. Well, some would say, well, the reason why they filled this gap was to reduce the amount of government involvement in the economy. Well, since 2007, before the recession really got going, population, the last basically almost 8 years now, has went up by 7% across the nation. How does it look with welfare programs? Food stamp recipients up.
I don't quite buy that argument, but there's a component of that in that.
Yes.
Comment on that?
Yes, and that's what this slide would have been. So I've actually broken it down by age groups. So if you break it down by age groups, 16 to 24-year-olds, 25 to 54-year-olds, and 55 plus, the only group, so it's 55 plus age group here, the only group that hasn't seen a decline in the labor force participation rate since October 2009 when we reached this high in the unemployment rate has been 55 plus. So even though they are aging, they're still working. Why? The recession took a huge hit on them. Many of their pension plans were depleted, right? So they have to work in order to continue to bring in more income to meet their needs. And so what you see is the largest decline in any of these age groups is 25 to 54-year-olds. They're moving back home with their parents. This is a huge drain. This is part of the reasoning why the American dream seems to be failing many people across the U.S. And it's a disturbing disconnect and a disturbing issue that's going to be very costly moving forward. Many of them are now going on disability, which is why I brought that up, right? Filing for disability in masses and continue to, and so they may never go back to work, right? Even if it's a minor disability that they ordinarily would had the situation been different. So once again, this looks a little different here too. But what I would argue is we need to look at the states now. The U.S. model is failing us. We need to look to the states. In this system of federalism, we have this laboratory of competition. So I did recently in a paper, it's a labor market comparison, why the Texas model supports prosperity, and I believe it'll be on the website for this conference, but it's also on our website at texaspolicy.com. But it looks at the differences between Texas, Florida, California, and New York, the 4 largest states in terms of population and economic output. And when you look at this is Economic Freedom of North America, again by the Fraser Institute. New York is ranked 46th. And this was in 2000. Okay, the red is in 2000, and then the blues are in 2012, the latest data that's available. So they're now 47th. California, 39th, 43rd. Florida, 6th, now they're 21st. Quite a decline in Florida looking at their economic freedom. And in Texas, we were 3rd, and now we're ranked 1st. If you look at all of North America, Texas is ranked 3rd. You have Alberta and I believe Ontario, Canada, that are ranked 1st and 2nd. But in North America, we're ranked 1st. So something seems to be going right when you look at these different sides of government and things that are going on in Texas. So economic growth, when you look at economic growth here on the y-axis and economic freedom here, there's a positive correlation between higher levels of economic freedom, and higher levels of economic output per capita. Per capita here. And so it's important to have more economic freedom. It's important not to increase the size of government, and so forth. When you look at the states without an income tax and those with an income tax, so these states here without an income tax, 9 of them, and the highest income tax states in the nation, population growth, more than double in those states without an income tax. Migration is positive, and this is from 2003 to 2013, compared to people leaving those states that have an higher income tax. Non-farm payrolls, I mean, you just go down the list, and it's even in state and local tax revenue is greater. You have lower taxes, you have more economic growth, right? And so it's bringing in more revenue. I'd actually like to see this be less revenue, but at least it shows the point that having less taxes overall is bringing in more revenue. So you don't need these high taxes that's slowing down economic growth. The state's budget, as James mentioned, here in Texas, when you look at the Texas tax structure, this is how we bring in the overall revenue. General revenue, which is primarily contributed by our state sales tax of 6 1/4, brings in about 55% of general revenue. And these are expenditures, where 3/4 of our budget go to health and human services and to education. About a little bit more than a third of our budget, about 37%, comes from federal funds. We'd like to see that also be dwindled down over time. Too many rules and regulations, right? There's red tape that's associated with those federal funds. In the state of Texas, we have some issues going on with the amount of spending that we've talked a lot about, and we've continued to hit on. We need to pass conservative budgets here at the state level. If you look at from 2004-05, because we have a 2-year budget cycle, right? So they meet once every 2 years for 140 days here in Texas, which we think is a good thing. We want them to be part-time. It reduces the amount of time that they can mess up things even more. And so you have this increase in spending by 68.7%, but if you adjust it for population and inflation, that's went up 52.4%, we're still spending about 11% more than population growth and inflation, even in the state of Texas. And this is why we're saying, hey, we need to make sure that we continue to not grow more than population and inflation, which, as James mentioned, was 6.5%. during the last 2 fiscal years, which is why we promoted that number, and they ended up coming in at 3.6%. So it was almost half of that overall measure. We'd like for it maybe to actually fall, but hey, 3.6% is definitely better than what we've seen in the past. So I'll skip that. So what do the labor market really look like over time? Why does the Texas model seem to work? Right? And so this shows, a couple slides here looking at the labor market. This is average annual job creation from 2000 to 2014. Looking at over the last 15 years, the average in Texas has been 1.6%, which is average annual job creation. The next highest was Florida of 1%. The national average was 0.5%, 0.7% in California. And so this is where the kind of the Texas jobs miracle comes from. Much faster job creation over time. The unemployment rate has also remained lower, so the red here in each case will be Texas, right? Especially since the Great Recession, our unemployment rate has been much lower. And even today, or yesterday, it was reported a 5% unemployment rate across the U.S. The Texas unemployment rate is 4.2%, which has been below the national average now for 105 consecutive months. So you can do the math, that's quite a few years, right? When you look at the labor force participation rate, right? Labor force participation rate took a little bit of a dip during the Great Recession, but not much compared to these other states in the national average. As more people are actually moving to Texas, which is also makes it quite remarkable of how low the unemployment rate's been as we've been able to employ those that are moving here from California and other places that have these high tax rates. The prime age working group, 25 to 54-year-olds, which I really think is the one area you want to look at from this graying population, which may distort some of the other measures. When you really look at that group continues to work, okay? And will need to be working to pay for pensions and Social Security and all these things. The one that's remained the highest has been here in Texas and has come up here this last couple of years. When you exclude Texas out of the equation, from December 2007, when the Great Recession began, up to December 2014, right, the rest of the nation employed fewer 400,000 people. Texas alone employed 1.6 million more people. If you exclude Texas out of this recovery, it would be a very weak recovery. Practically no recovery at all. And some say, well, it's only from oil and gas jobs, right? Y'all have heard that. It's all just oil and gas jobs, whatever. But that's not the case, okay? If you look from 2000 to 2014, over this period, the oil and gas extracting and mining support has went up 110% over that period. However, that's only about 150,000 jobs, okay? When you look at educational and health services or professional and business services, it's went up 39%, but that's been over 400,000 jobs that have been added. Look at all these jobs here that were much greater than the oil and gas extracting and mining. That particular part of our labor force is only 2.6% of the labor force. Okay, so it's not all oil and gas jobs. And these also haven't been just low-paying jobs. If you look from 2001, Texas' real average annual pay, so adjusted for inflation, has went up by 10.2%, whereas the national average is only up by 6.1%. So we're up 67% compared to the national average. This shows by each quartile, right? Upper, middle, and highest wages in Texas have been the highest here. If you exclude U.S. minus Texas, right, we have highest wage jobs only up 14%, lowest is up 11.3%. And some say, well, you just have more income inequality in the state of Texas with all this less redistributionary policies. That's also not the case, even if income inequality means something, which I don't necessarily think it does, okay? But let's say it does, and you go off of Piketty's work and Capital in the 21st Century, y'all know about all this stuff, okay? And even then, if you compare California's high redistributionary policies with Texas' low taxes, the red line again, this is in the top 10% of income shares of the overall taxes, or the overall income for the state. Texas brings in about 53%. We're pretty close, but when you look at the average from 2000 to 2012, Texas is below. We're at 48.8% compared to about 50% in California. So even with those high redistributionary policies, we still have lower income inequality. Quite remarkable. Poverty. When you measure the official poverty measure, or you look at the official poverty measure, it shows that we're near the highest in Texas. But this doesn't account for some of the things that James discussed of the much lower cost that we have here in Texas, the cost of living. What does that say? 1 minute. All right, good. The poverty here, and so in California, is near the national average. We're higher here in Texas, okay? But if you adjust for the cost of living and government welfare programs, which are just a few here in Texas, we're actually near the national average at 15.9%, whereas California has the highest in the nation because they have a 50% higher cost of living than the state of Texas. All right? And this goes through a lot of other things here, but the Business Tax Climate Index is important to look at when it's 10th in the nation. And so what we've looked at here at the state level is saying that we need to get rid of our business franchise tax. That would help to improve our state business tax climate index. And as we know, this business tax is just a tax that, also didn't come out correctly, but the business tax also, any business tax is just passed on to the consumer in the form of higher prices, lower wages, and fewer jobs that are available. And so what we've looked at is saying, okay, if we were able to eliminate the margin tax, some research that we did was to show what would be the increase in personal income, about $16 billion more personal income than what we have today, and in job growth, about 130,000 more jobs. So we need to get rid of this onerous business tax. We've also looked at is property taxes. Property tax is also one of the failures. The business tax, the property tax are our two big failures. Property taxes, as James mentioned, is about $1,600 on average per every man, woman, and child. 14th highest burden in the nation according to the Tax Foundation. And so what we've said is that, kind of go through these some, what we've said is really we need to get rid of our property tax. We need to get rid of our business tax. We need to get rid of property taxes and move to a reformed sales tax here in the state of Texas, where instead of taxing property and its ownership of capital, why not use a sales tax instead? And over time, what you find is that sales taxes tend to grow at a slower rate than property taxes. So not only can we do it as a revenue neutral way, but you can grow the size of government at a slower rate, which is what we hope to all see. Because as we've seen, that hopefully I've made a good case here, the American dream is not dead. It's just moved to Texas, right? It's moved to the Lone Star State. That's where it's heading. And that's the direction we need to head for all the United States. So thank you all again. Have a great day.